the company.
Northern California earthquake kills more than 270, levels some buildings and disrupts utilities. State and federal officials rush in with disaster aid. Weather threatens new delay for shuttle Atlantis. Good morning, Bill Lynch with the CBS World News Roundup. For the launch of Space Shuttle Atlantis, Christopher Glenn has the latest.
In addition to worrying about a marginal weather forecast for today's launch attempt, NASA and the Air Force are also assessing damage to a critical ground tracking station in Sunnyvale, California, in the heart of the earthquake zone. Overnight reports indicate the facility, which will handle data transmission from the Galileo Jupiter probe's own booster rocket once it's deployed, is up and running, but whether it'll be able to handle its entire workload is still unknown. At any rate, Atlantis has been refueled, and preparations for launch a little before 1 Eastern Time are proceeding normally. Christopher Glenn, CBS News, Kennedy Space Center, Florida.
The shuttle will also be landing in California next Monday at Edwards Air Force Base, an area not affected by the quake. Obviously, we'll keep you up to date on the latest on the quake, but now we're just about 2 minutes away from a liftoff, a launch that has been delayed 7 years by budgetary problems and the Challenger blow-up. Scientists call it the most important planetary mission yet, and if Galileo fulfills its scheduled 8-year mission, the spacecraft could uncover the history of the solar system. In the control center, Lisa Malone is keeping track of these last seconds of the countdown, and we're listening to the astronauts on board the Atlantis herself. We were getting the last
bump. 2 minutes away now from launch. All systems are go.
Lisa Malone in launch control. We're 1 minute and 35 seconds from launch. There are no clouds in the sky at the moment. Everything appears
1 minute, 30 seconds.
Ready for launch, even at the transatlantic abort sites. What that means is, in case there's trouble between here and the European coast, the astronauts could land in an emergency at Saragossa, Spain. The weather has cleared there.
Ready, and the liquid hydrogen tank is at flight pressure.
We're 1 minute and 10 seconds away from the launch. This has been this launch was scrubbed yesterday because of rain showers. It was scrubbed last week because of a flight controller in an engine.
1 minute and counting.
1 minute and counting. It looks like they're going to do it today.
Heaters on the booster joints are being deactivated.
Everything technically is ready, and the weather is holding at the moment. 45 seconds and counting.
Minus 45 seconds.
Lisa Malone in launch control. Standing by for the final seconds. The astronauts are ready. They have their visors down. This will be the beginning of a 5-day mission.
Let's go for auto sequence start.
We have a go for auto sequence start. Atlantis' 4 redundant computers have primary control of critical vehicle functions through liftoff.
20 seconds and counting.
15. 11, 10, 9. We have a go for main engine start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We have ignition and liftoff.
It's off. Atlantis is climbing from its launch tower. It is going up. Now, everything looks good for the liftoff at the moment. It's a big, bright orange flame coming from the bottom of Atlantis. She's climbing straight up, as she should. Let's listen now to the roar in the astronauts. Coming across our side, here's a crackling sound. It's beautiful, passing a small cloud.
A good roll maneuver. 3 engines throttling back now to 65% as Atlantis passes through the area of maximum dynamic pressure.
Oh, it's a beautiful launch. You can hear the big roar. She's going almost straight up, headed out across the Atlantis.
65%. APU's looking good. Velocity 2,000 feet per second.
Everything right on schedule now. It looks perfect. Atlantis is making a good, clean flight into orbit. The solids are burning as they should. Everything is running perfect at this time. Astronaut Don Williams and crew are on their way into orbit.
Velocity now 1,400 feet per second. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles.
The voice you're hearing belongs to Billy Deason,
Atlantis,
mission control.
go and throttle up.
Engines now throttle back. Engines now back to 104%. All systems performing well. Standing by for separation of these solid rocket boosters at 2 minutes and 4 seconds.
Everything is just perfect. It was a beautiful liftoff, a beautiful flight. They've been airborne now 1 minute and 30 seconds.
Velocity now 2,700 feet per second. Downrange 10 nautical miles.
They're now flying on their back as they should be out across the Atlantic, just going perfectly. Everything right on schedule here, nearing the end of the burnout of the solid rocket motors. Then the 3 main engines will take the 5 astronauts on into orbit. A beautiful liftoff, a beautiful clear day finally here. As weather scrubbed the flight yesterday, it threatened again here today. But now Atlantis is on its way into orbit, and we should be here on the separation of the SRBs. There they are. They've separated. The solid rocket motors are off perfect, right on time. And now...
Separation of SRBs confirmed. Velocity now 4,200 feet per second, downrange 33 nautical miles.
As Mission Control just reported, the solid rockets have burned out and have separated from the Atlantis, and now the astronauts should be safely on their way into orbit. In a little more than 6 hours, they will eject the huge Galileo spacecraft from the shuttle's cargo bay and start it on a merry-go-round journey across the solar system. Galileo will first fly by Venus, make 2 trips by Earth to search for an ice cap at our moon's north pole, then by 2 asteroids before moving on to Jupiter. It should reach the solar system's largest planet in 1995, where it will fire a probe into the liquid planet's atmosphere, while the Galileo spacecraft itself spends 2 years studying Jupiter and its moons. What Galileo learns could very well tell scientists how our solar system was born. I'm Jay Barbary at Cape Canaveral.
This has been a Mutual News special report, the launch of Shuttle Atlantis. This is the Mutual Broadcasting System.
CBS News, this is Mitchell Krause.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We have ignition and liftoff of Atlantis and the Galileo spacecraft bound for Jupiter.
After delays because of iffy weather and a computer problem, the Space Shuttle Atlantis has blasted off at the Kennedy Space Center. Christopher Glenn reports.
We can still see vaguely on NASA's long-range tracking cameras the ignition sequence still underway, the main engine still firing aboard Atlantis as it heads out across the Atlantic toward Africa. All of the conversations between the air and the ground and around the ground loop itself are that things are absolutely normal for this launch. There was such a long period of delay. Last week, you remember, there was a delay while they swapped out an engine computer for 5 days. Then yesterday, rain showers at the last minute forced a 24-hour scrub. There was the threat of rain today also, but it finally moved off, and they were able to get away just a couple of minutes late. The spacecraft carries the Galileo probe, which will be launched toward Jupiter when the crew deploys it a little later on in the flight, about 6.5 hours from now. Right at the moment, all looking well, all conversations normal, as Shuttle Atlantis begins its journey. Christopher Glenn, CBS News, Kennedy Space Center, Florida.
Frantic efforts are continuing in Oakland, California to reach victims who may still be alive in the rubble of Interstate 880, whose upper level collapsed onto the lower roadway during last night's severe earthquake.
Late and dodging rain clouds, the Space Shuttle Atlantis finally roars off the pad. Meantime, across the continent, the search drags on for victims of the devastating Bay Area earthquake. Headline News, I'm Jill Chernikov. We'll have more on the shuttle launch in just a few minutes. Atlantis is in orbit. After a flawless liftoff, the shuttle carrying the nuclear-powered Galileo space probe is now preparing to deploy it. Yesterday's launch was canceled because of weather. Today, Atlantis snaked its way up between 2 storm systems. 2 minutes and 4 seconds into the launch, the shuttle separated from its 2 solid rocket boosters. Atlantis and its crew of 5 will be in orbit for 5 days.
CBS News, I'm Mike Moss. The shuttle Atlantis is in orbit, and Christopher Glenn reports from the Kennedy Space Center that deployment of the costly and complex Galileo probe is near.
Mission Commander Don Williams thanked ground control for a spectacular launch, declaring Atlantis a magnificent spaceship shortly after liftoff. Indeed, very few problems, none of them serious, have been reported by the 3 men and 2 women of the Atlantis crew during the first 6 hours of their 5-day flight. They've been busy, though, getting ready for the major task of the mission, coming up in a little more than an hour, deploying the $1.5 billion Galileo spacecraft from the cargo bay and starting it off on a 6-year journey to giant Jupiter. Christopher Glenn, CBS News, Kennedy Space Center, Florida.
Half an hour from now, the shuttle Atlantis is expected to deploy its controversial probe Galileo. Mother Nature gave her blessing to the launch just before noon today, a $1.5 billion mission that got off the ground 7 years behind schedule. If Galileo works properly, it'll arrive at Jupiter in December of 1995 for a 2-year reconnaissance orbit. President Bush says it's too early to tell whether the change in leadership in East Germany will mean political reform for that nation. Communist Party Chief Erich Honecker has been replaced by a 52-year-old Politburo member named Egon Krenz. A Northwest
deployment, the solid fuel IUS booster will fire to send Galileo out of Earth orbit. After deployment of Galileo, the 5 Atlantis astronauts have a series of scientific experiments to conduct during their 5-day mission. The first stages of some of those experiments will be initiated on this first day of flight, but the on-orbit work will intensify on flight day 2. The experiments include the Shuttle Solar Backscattered Ultraviolet Experiment, SSBUV, which is an effort to calibrate spaceborne sensors measuring the ozone layer. Mission specialist Franklin Chang Diaz will turn on that equipment before ending his first day in flight. Also, before the astronauts go to sleep for their first night in space, the first samples will be started for the PM, or Polymer Morphology Experiment. This is a test by the 3M company in which various plastics materials will be melted and then photographed as they solidify to determine the effects of weightlessness. Atlantis was launched from Cape Canaveral at 11:53 a.m. Central Daylight Time. That was 3 minutes and 40 seconds late, caused by a last-minute switch in transatlantic emergency sites from Morocco to Zaragoza, Spain.
Everything is going really well. I think Shannon reported just probably 30 minutes ago at her first looks at the Galileo, said it was in great shape. She was excited about it. And I just saw some views of it also, and we're anxious, looking for deploy here in the next couple hours. We are in a orbit 161 by 161 nautical miles. Deploy should occur at 6 hours, 21 minutes, 22 seconds MET. And that will be followed 15 minutes later by a set burn of approximately 30 foot per second. There are a couple of failures that have occurred since we launched this morning. The first thing that happened during powered flight, we noticed that an APU, one of our auxiliary power units, APU number 1, shifted from its normal speed to a high-speed range. Now, there are 2 speeds to an APU. Normally, we run them in what is called normal speed. The high-speed range is there because it delivers more horsepower, and we use it if we had failed an APU. We'll take the other remaining APUs to high speed, and then we can run our surfaces without any loss of efficiency. So when this shifted to high speed, it's really no impact to us. The APU runs fine. It's just something that's a little off nominal for us. We think what caused the shift was probably a speed sensor that failed, and then it shifted to the upper band.
Continuing coverage of National Space Society's Dial-A Shuttle program, we're breaking into what you've been listening to, which was the Ascent press conference, or at least a summary of that press conference from this afternoon, highlighting the activities of Atlantis' launch into space this afternoon. We're coming up on about 1 minute now from the deployment of the Galileo spacecraft from the payload bay of Atlantis.
Deploy -1 minute, and I'll still go. All systems still looking good for deploy now in 55 seconds.
Just over 2 minutes ago, Flight Director Milt Heflin pulled the Galileo people from the Mission Control Center in Houston, and Galileo is
30 seconds now before deploy Galileo. We have confirmation the orbiter has gone to free drift as intended. We're now 16 seconds to deploy. 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10 seconds now before deploy Galileo. Standing by now for confirmation of deploy. And the Sunnyvale Flight Director has just confirmed the successful deploy of the inertial upper stage and Galileo.
Live confirmation from Sunnyvale that the Galileo and its IUS booster were successfully deployed from the payload bay of the orbiter Atlantis just 1 minute ago. Everything seems to be running fine. Later on, after the Atlantis separates,
Galileo reports positive telemetry of deploy. Also, we see the orbiter performing a -X translation maneuver to move away from the IUS Galileo stack.
Prime Houston, the spacecraft is stable. Galileo is on its way to another world. It's in the hands of the best flight controllers in this world. Fly safe.
Roger, Atlantis, we copy. That's great news. Thanks.
The Galileo spacecraft has been deployed just 2 minutes ago from the payload bay of Atlantis. It is on its way to Jupiter through a convoluted series of encounters with Venus, 2 with Earth, a couple of asteroids. Should be arriving there in about 6 years or so. Successful deployment of the primary payload Galileo from Atlantis today. Activities earlier were summarized in the press conference that was held following the successful ascent to orbit of the shuttle orbiter Atlantis.
The impact of the mission is none. We'll Bay, LRU's line replaceable unit. Okay. And it is located in the aft compartment of the shuttle. And when it failed, we have some procedures that we use. One of the things that you would normally think about is just cycling the power. If your computer failed at home or if it got locked up and you couldn't reset it, the first thing you do is reboot it. And that's what we tried. We tried a power cycle, and that worked. And unfortunately, it wasn't permanent, because later on we saw the same type of failure. It failed again. We tried power cycling several times. Each time it would recover, then it would subsequently fail. When we got into the Ops 2 time frame, once we were on orbit, had Ops 2 software loaded into our computers. We have a capability where we can port mode the MDM. Now, an MDM has some redundancy in its internal parts where you can switch from a primary port to a secondary port without any loss of capability. And we switched to the secondary ports, regained the MDM, and now it's working fine.
Flight Director Ron Ditmore. With this report on Atlantis' initial hours of flight, I'm Pete Capisser.
Dr. Ellen Baker will be using her medical background as the mission specialist in charge of the medical DSOs, or detailed supplementary objectives. About 1 month before launch, Baker described the activities which will take place pre- and post-flight, as well as during the flight.
What we're doing in flight is retinal photography, like Don mentioned, and that's an experiment to take a picture of the blood vessels on the back of the eyeball, which are very sensitive to changes in pressure in the brain. And the theory is that with the fluid shifting that you normally get when you're on orbit, there can be some swelling in the brain, which can account for some of the symptoms that we see in the first couple of days in flight. And so we would like to see if we can quantitate whether, well, first of all, determine whether there is any swelling, and then be able to quantitate it to some degree.
Standing by now for confirmation of the IUS burn, which should be occurring right now.
This is Mission Control. The Propulsion Systems Officer reports 2 ohms engine ignition aboard Atlantis, and it looks good.
There was the live confirmation of the, not the IUS burn, but the ohms burn, which is the separation maneuver for Atlantis to move away from the Galileo spacecraft and its IUS.
Separation burn confirmed complete, and the residuals look good.
This is Dial Shuttle bringing you continuing coverage of the STS-34 mission to launch the Galileo spacecraft on its trip to Jupiter. That deploy coming successfully. Just 18 minutes ago, and 3 minutes ago, the orbiter Atlantis firing ohms engines to separate from the Galileo spacecraft before the IUS booster on the spacecraft performs its burn.
The Society's Dial Shuttle service with continuous coverage of the STS-34 Atlantis Galileo mission from the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. This 24-hour public information service is made possible by the revenue from your phone call and the National Space Society's commitment to space education in the public interest.
The crew of the Space Shuttle Atlantis is working through the timeline toward the primary objective of their flight, the deployment of the Galileo spacecraft to Jupiter. 6 hours, 21 minutes after launch from Cape Canaveral on orbit number 5 over the Gulf of Mexico near Brownsville, Texas, the Galileo will be sprung out of the payload bay to begin its 6-year, 2.5 billion mile journey to Jupiter. Deployment time will be at 6:14 p.m. Central Daylight Time. Pre-deployment activities have gone smoothly. There were minor communications problems between the astronauts' control panel and the computer of the inertial upper stage booster, but that problem was cleared up. 1 hour after deployment, the solid fuel IUS booster will fire to send Galileo out of Earth orbit. After deployment of Galileo, the 5 Atlantis astronauts have a series of scientific experiments to conduct during their 5-day mission. The first stages of some of those experiments will be initiated on this first day of flight, but the on-orbit work will intensify on flight day 2. The experiments include the Shuttle Solar Backscatter Ultraviolet Experiment, SSBUV, which is an effort to calibrate spaceborne sensors measuring the ozone layer. Mission Specialist Franklin Chang Diaz will turn on that equipment before ending his first day in flight. Also, before the astronauts go to sleep for their first night in space, the first samples will be started for the PM, or Polymer Morphology Experiment. This is a test by the 3M company in which various plastics materials will be melted and then photographed as they solidify to determine the effects of weightlessness. Atlantis was launched from Cape Canaveral at 11:53 a.m. Central Daylight Time. That was 3 minutes and 40 seconds late, caused by a last-minute switch in transatlantic emergency sites from Morocco to Zaragoza, Spain.
Headline News, I'm Lynn Russell.
Good news for NASA from the shuttle Atlantis. We get it from correspondent Jay Barbary at Cape Canaveral.
The shuttle Atlantis was streaking across Baja, California when Crew Commander Don Williams reported the nearly 3-ton Galileo planetary craft had been deployed.
Galileo is on its way to another world. It's in the hands of the best flight controllers in this world.
In less than 15 minutes, Galileo's rockets should fire to start it on its 6-year journey to the planet Jupiter.
The new leader of East Germany, Egon Krenz, does not plan to share power with any pro-democracy faction. Krenz, who replaced Erich Honecker, says there are already...
SRM-1 burnout, on time and on schedule. Atlantis, Houston.
Houston, Atlantis.
I just want to let you know that Sunnyvale's just reported that SRM-1 is complete.
That sounds like good news. Was it a good burn?
We're checking on that right now. And some more words on that cyclone I mentioned earlier. I think I may have understated that. It's being called a super typhoon, named Elsie. Winds right now are sustained at 135, gusting to 165, and it's just east of Luzon.
Okay, we'll be looking for that. And keep us posted on what's going on with IUS and Galileo. We sort of have a vested interest in it.
Yes, ma'am, we'll do that.
You're listening to the National Space Society's Dial a Shuttle service with continuous coverage of the STS-34 Atlantis Galileo mission from the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. This 24-hour public information service is made possible by the revenue from your phone call and the National Space Society's commitment to space education in the public interest. We just received confirmation just moments ago from Sunnyvale, California, tracking the Galileo and IUS stack, that the solid rocket motor engine 1 burn on the IUS was started on time and was successful.
Events are happening in quick succession aboard the inertial upper stage. Go ahead, Atlantis.
Yeah, Mike, we're all set up to send you some VTR views of the stable racing and deploy and all the other events post-deploy. It was scheduled for 7:30, but we're ready now.
Okay, Franklin, we copy that. Stand by, and we'll let you know when we're ready.
The Galileo planetary exploration spacecraft is now on its way to Jupiter after being put into low Earth orbit by the space shuttle Atlantis and boosted on its 2.5 billion mile trip by an inertial upper stage. Dr. Torrance Johnson of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California is the project scientist for Galileo. In a pre-launch briefing, he describes some of the goals of Galileo, both at Jupiter and on the way there.
Our objectives are broken up into three major areas, but of course there are lots of interactions amongst them. We're going to be investigating the planet itself, the large magnetic environment around Jupiter. Jupiter has the largest known magnetic field of any planet and controls a huge volume of space around it with very intense Van Allen-style radiation belts. There are also, of course, these four worlds circling around Jupiter in a manner similar to the planets around the Sun, the Galilean satellites. And there are interactions amongst all of those things. Now, in addition to those major objectives, as Bill mentioned, we have an opportunity on this mission to do a lot of very interesting science on the way. We're going to get an encounter by Venus. We expect to be using our new instrumentation that hasn't flown to Venus before, to probe Venus, look for lightning, look at the atmospheric water abundances on Venus, follow up on some of the things that were opened up to us by the Pioneer Venus program, for instance, and it's quite complementary to the surface studies that will be made by the radar mission Magellan, which will get there somewhat after us. On the way back then to the Earth, we'll be making interplanetary cruise measurements of interplanetary dust, the hydrogen abundance in the inner solar system to compare with the outer solar system, and preparing for our Earth encounter. Earth-Moon encounter is very interesting to all of us on the project because we get a chance sort of to explore our own system, our home planet system, if you will, in a manner of extraterrestrial explorers coming into it for the first time. I'm not sure what we'll find. We may get some surprises. We do have some instruments on board that haven't been flown to look at the Earth before, and we have a unique perspective. We'll be looking at parts of the Moon that haven't been looked at with modern instrumentation. The Apollo missions looked at only a narrow equatorial belt around the Moon, and much of the far side of the Moon and the polar areas of the Moon have not been looked at since the 60s. So we're expecting to get some new information there. And even on our own Earth, there may be some things to tell us. We have ultraviolet scans of the entire Earth-Moon system to look at the hydrogen environment around the Earth, for instance. We'll also be making measurements in the infrared of the mesospheric water abundance, that is, water abundance in the mid to upper altitudes of the Earth's atmosphere. This is a quantity that's very poorly measured over the entire Earth at the moment and is an important ingredient for people making calculations of exactly how the ozone layer on the Earth's atmosphere is produced and destroyed, photochemical calculations. In addition to which, I think it'll just be fun to take a look at the Earth as if we were on an extraterrestrial spacecraft, taking a look at our planet coming up as a crescent. We'll be coming in from the dark side and receding on the bright side and watching Earth recede in our television cameras.
Dr. Torrance Johnson, the project scientist for the Galileo project. With this report on the Galileo mission, this is Bob Chancellor.
We're going to be investigating the planet itself.
Informed and sports. AM 1250 KRNS San Antonio.
Still no survivors beneath collapsed roadway, and $250 million in aid en route to quake region. With Mutual PM, I'm Fred Lowry in Washington. Thus orbiting the Earth, the main task of its mission having been completed, launching the Galileo probe toward the planet Jupiter. The astronauts opened the cargo bay and sent the probe on its way earlier this evening.
Galileo is on its way to another world. It's in the hands of the best flight controllers in this world. Fly safe.
Roger, Atlantis, we copy. That's great news. Thanks.
The shuttle astronauts have reported a few problems aboard Atlantis, but they are considered minor. The space shuttle is set to return to Earth Monday afternoon.
Strong new aftershocks jolt Northern California disaster area. At least 18 dead in a series of quakes in China. Shuttle Atlantis crew succeeds in launching Jupiter probe. Good morning. Bill Lynch with the CBS World News Roundup. In China, at least... The crew of Shuttle Atlantis is up and working. Christopher Glenn reports.
A proud Commander Don Williams sent word to Mission Control as the crew completed the main task of the 5-day flight, deployment of the $1.4 billion Jupiter probe for the start of its 6-year journey to the giant planet.
The spacecraft is stable. Galileo is on its way to another world. It's in the hands of the best flight controllers in this world. Fly safe.
Day 2 will find the crew working with a new device that could help pin down the rate of deterioration of Earth's protective ozone layer, an increasingly worrisome phenomenon for environmental scientists. Christopher Glenn, CBS News, at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida.
President Bush heading west to inspect California earthquake damage as officials lower death estimate in freeway collapse. 20 are dead in the crash of an Australian tour bus, 9 of them members of the same family. Good morning. Bill Lynch with the CBS World News Roundup. Spending their 3rd day in space, continuing to conduct experiments. New fears for stability of collapsed Oakland freeway as Congress takes up billions in quake aid. Shuttle Atlantis prepares for early landing in California. Once communist Hungary proclaims itself Democratic Republic. Good morning. Bill Lynch with the CBS World News Roundup. The Shuttle Atlantis crew, having deployed the Galileo Jupiter probe and conducted a series of experiments, is packing up for a slightly early homecoming.
This is Christopher Glenn at Edwards Air Force Base in California.
Good morning, Atlantis. Your planning team is looking forward to watching you fly home today.
Well, that sounds like a good plan.
The Atlantis astronauts were roused from their last sleep in weightlessness an hour earlier than planned to accommodate a run for the runway some 3 hours earlier. They're trying to get home before crosswinds pick up to unacceptable levels for a safe landing. Flight Director Ron Dittemore says the crew isn't disappointed at having to lose their last 2 orbits.
Their concern mainly lies with what the weather conditions are at Edwards. They were planning to come home all along, and coming home an hour or 2 early won't make any difference.
If the schedule is maintained, Atlantis should cross the California coast high above the San Fernando Valley and then swoop steeply to touchdown just after 9:30 a.m. Pacific Time. Christopher Glenn, CBS News, Edwards Air Force Base, California.
In a simple ceremony in Parliament, Hungary has made it official, declaring an end to 40 years of communist rule and proclaiming itself a republic.
News. I'm Jim Sheneby. The San Francisco Bay Area is back in business. That's the message city leaders are trying to get out this week in the wake of last Tuesday's 6.9 earthquake. But getting back to business is proving to be a hefty chore for the area's commuters. Correspondent Rob Armstrong reports. Shuttle Atlantis preparing to fire the ship's retro rockets in about a half hour from now for a scheduled landing at 9:32 a.m. Pacific Time.
As Atlantis begins to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere, the commander and pilot will make some wide sweeping turns or roll reversals to dissipate the energy and slow the vehicle down as it begins to make its final approach into the Edwards Air Force Base.
Atlantis being brought down to Earth 2 orbits earlier than first planned in an attempt to beat high winds forecast for that Mojave Desert runway later in the day. The flight control team beamed up a message to the astronauts this morning saying congratulations on a great mission and we're keeping the beer cold.
CBS News, I'm Bill Lynch. Shuttle Atlantis has put on its rocket brakes and is starting a superheated glide home from 5 days in orbit. Christopher Glenn is waiting for it at Edwards Air Force Base.
Bill, the deorbit burn was described by the ground teams as nominal, meaning everything was okay, and the Atlantis will be here just about a half hour from now. Right at this point, they're touching the top of Earth's atmosphere, creating friction that will increase as the air gets denser and causing Atlantis to heat up until it literally glows. They're traveling some 24 times the speed of sound, and they're still some 4,000 miles or so out. It was touchy here for a while this morning, trying to decide whether they might have to be waved off for one more trip around the world, but finally an unusual blanket of fog over the runway did burn off, and they got their go to come home. About a half hour left.
Christopher Glenn at Edwards Air Force Base. Tens of thousands of commuters will be late for work in the San Francisco Bay Area, and for the most part, they'll have good excuses. First, there's the stormy weather.
It's not a very pretty sight this morning. Starting at Durham Road in Fremont, it is jammed up solid, stop and go all the way down.
Then there are the massive detours around quake-damaged roads and bridges. Many who took ferries to escape traffic gridlock turned green on the storm-tossed bay. This commuter told of a worried fellow passenger.
One poor lady was singing Amazing Grace all the way across. I don't think she'll make it back. I think she'll find another way to get back over to the city.
Mutual News Special Report. The landing of Shuttle Atlantis. The crew of Atlantis is preparing to touch down in the California desert. Let's go live to correspondent Steve Futterman at Edwards Air Force Base.
Good day from California. We're just around 3 minutes from the scheduled touchdown of Atlantis, a touchdown which is taking place around 3 hours earlier. You've just heard those two sonic booms. That means Atlantis is on its way. The touchdown is taking place around 3 hours earlier than originally scheduled, this due to expected winds. Another problem cropped up earlier today, thick fog. 2 hours ago, Mission Control was quite concerned.
The fog at Edwards has not burned off nor lifted as quickly as forecasters thought earlier this morning.
But the fog did burn off, and just over an hour ago, NASA officials told Atlantis, come home.
Atlantis, Houston, the lake bed is go, and you're go for deorbit burn.
And right now we can see Atlantis as it comes down. It's coming down at a very steep angle, around a 22-degree angle.
Atlantis, Houston, you're looking great. Turning on the hack. Surface is clear. Altimeter is 3019.
Atlantis getting the instructions from Mission Control, and now any moment we should have the flare maneuver.
The imaginary line around the heading alignment circle. Macaulay will make a right overhead turn, lining up on runway 23 at Edwards.
Runway 23, that's a 5-mile-long runway on the dry lake bed. Now it's beginning to cut down the angle, and you'll hear possibly from Mission Control the term a flare maneuver.
Winds at the landing site are forecast at 6 knots headwind, 5 knots left crosswind, well within our landing limits.
Much lower than earlier expected.
600 feet per second, altitude 18,000 feet.
Down to 18,000 feet now. This is the 6th post-Challenger mission. It's been a very successful mission. The primary goal of Atlantis was to deploy that Galileo probe to Jupiter, and it did that successfully. Galileo's now on a very long mission to Jupiter. It will arrive there on, if it goes on schedule, December 1995. Right now, Atlantis making its, I believe this is its final turn as it approaches runway 23, and everything looking good.
Atlantis around the final part of the heading alignment circle at 400 feet per second velocity, altitude 15,000 feet, 8 miles from touchdown. We're about a minute and a half away from touchdown of Atlantis.
So the landing going to be a bit later than we originally thought, but...
Macaulay now in the final approach at about 19 degrees glide slope.
19 degrees. At one point, it was coming down at 22 degrees. That's very steep, much steeper than your traditional jet aircraft come down at airports around the country.
Atlantis, Houston, we see you on center line, on glide slope.
That's
Surface
very good.
winds 190 at 8, 6 head, 5 left.
The gusty winds have not come up, so Atlantis, everything looking good. We see it slowly coming down.
Atlantis up into the pre-flare maneuver at about 2,500 feet, adjusting the glide slope angle to about 1.5 degrees.
That flare maneuver basically cuts down the angle. It comes down at a steep angle. Once it gets on the glide line, the center approach for the runway, it cuts down that angle so it can land. And the last thing we should see is the rear and the front landing gear come down. That will be just around 17 seconds before the actual touchdown. Atlantis approaching runway 23. This is the 25th landing at Edwards Air Force Base. This obviously the primary landing spot for Atlantis. And now we see Atlantis looking beautiful. The skies have cleared, and we're now waiting for the landing gears to come down, and the rear gears have come down. And now we're waiting for the scene we've watched many times as the rear gear touches first. We're around
altitude 390 feet.
Any moments now. And now the rear gears have touched. We see the dirt rise, and now getting ready for the front gears to come down. Any moments now. And the front gear has touched down. Atlantis. Atlantis is back on Earth.
Atlantis rolls out at the conclusion of mission STS-34, correction.
Whatever number it is, it was very successful, and Atlantis back on Earth. A 5-day mission complete, and now in the background you may be able to hear the national anthem being played. This is what
unofficial main gear touchdown time was at 9:33 a.m. Pacific Daylight Time.
Around a minute later than originally planned, but after 5 days, a minute late isn't too bad. So Commander Donald Williams and pilot Michael McCauley successfully bring Atlantis back to Earth. And this mission has come to a successful end. It was the 31st mission in the overall shuttle program.
Roger, Atlantis. Congratulations on an outstanding mission. You've extended the shuttle's reach to the outer planets. Bravo Zulu.
Atlantis has been officially welcomed back to Earth, the end of its 5-day mission. I'm Steve Futterman at Edwards Air Force Base in California.
This has been a Mutual News special report, the landing of Shuttle Atlantis. This is the Mutual Broadcasting System.
CBS News. I'm Jim Shenevey. A thumbs-up assessment from NASA to the completed mission of the Space Shuttle Atlantis. The shuttle returned to Earth about a half hour ago. Correspondent Christopher Glenn is at Edwards Air Force Base.
Smooth as glass, Atlantis slipped down from orbit to a perfect landing on the dusty, dry lake bed runway, tracking right down the center line to wheel stop.
Roger, Atlantis. Congratulations on an outstanding mission. You've extended the shuttle's reach to the outer planets.
Shuttle communicator Ken Cameron in Houston passing congratulations to the 3-man, 2-woman crew. On their first day of flight, they deployed the $1.4 billion Galileo probe and started it on a 6-year journey to Jupiter. Right now, the ground teams that safe and service the orbiter are swarming around the spaceship. The astronauts are still inside. They've been given permission to take off the pressure suits they wear for launch and landing and should be coming down the steps shortly to test their legs in gravity for the first time in 5 days. Christopher Glenn, CBS News, Edwards Air Force Base, California.